33 of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. Before we begin, I would ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines written on the updated cards on the table in front of you. These are measures in place to help prevent feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, especially our interpreters. You'll notice there's a QR code on the card, which links to a short awareness video. Pursuant to the routine motion adopted by the committee, I can confirm that the witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of this meeting. I do think we have some witnesses online today, although I don't see them yet. Please wait until I recognize you by name before you speak. All comments should be addressed through the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 22nd, 2025, the committee is meeting to study the state of the journalism and media sectors. And before we get started, I think I'll just point out that I believe, Monsieur Généreux, est-ce que c'est votre fête aujourd'hui?
Mr. Généreux, is it your birthday today?
Bonne fête.
Happy birthday, happy birthday.
C'est votre...
Oh my gosh, it's your birthday too? No. Mr. Généreux? Mr. Shampoo? I'd just like to say, oh, we all want to look as good as Bernard at his age. Congratulations.
Can we get these witnesses on the screen in front of us? Thank you. We have with us today Marie-Philippe Bouchard from CPC Radio-Canada. We have also local independent television stations online with us today. Calvin Miller, president of Channel Zero. Full disclosure, Channel Zero is the company that owns CHCH, where I worked for 20 years, so I know Cal well. Rod Schween, also president of Pattinson Media. We have also Torstar Corporation, Angus Frame, president, here with us in the room. Good morning, sir. And from the Hub, Rudyard Griffiths joins us online. Welcome to everyone. You will each have 5 minutes as a group, if you're here with a group, to give us opening statements. And we'll start with Marie-Philippe Bouchard from CBC Radio-Canada. Madame, vous avez la parole pour...
You have the floor for 5 minutes. Madam Chair, members of the committee, at my last appearance, we discussed the challenges facing Canadian media organizations. As previous witnesses have highlighted, foreign giants are monopolizing digital ad revenues to the tune of 96.5%. This has enormous repercussions for Canadian media at a time when traditional ad revenues continue to decline. In this rapidly shifting landscape, CBC Radio-Canada is especially mindful of its responsibility as Canada's public broadcaster.
To draw your attention to how CBC Radio-Canada is contributing to the Canadian media sector. From content sharing and journalist training to advertising and joint advocacy on common causes, we are prioritizing collaboration with other Canadian media. In terms of content, for example, CBC and the Toronto Star have partnered on a new investigative crime podcast about Ryan Wedding, the Canadian Olympian turned FBI most wanted fugitive. CBC Radio-Canada also shares content with other media. In Tumbler Ridge, for example, we organized the camera pool at the memorial service, providing live video to other media covering the story and keeping the number of cameras to a minimum out of respect for the community. Similarly, several CBC daily newsletters linked to articles from private local media, such as in Fort St. John, Medicine Hat, and Sault Ste. Marie. Dans certains lieux, notamment à
In certain places, notably Iqaluit and Rimouski, we offer our hourly radio newscast to community radio stations. In terms of publicity, CBC Radio-Canada gives media partners with free ad inventory to provide their news content to a wider audience. CBC Radio-Canada also contributes to training initiatives. For instance, Radio-Canada invited other media outlets to participate in Journalisme 6x5, an event organized with the group Les Coop de l'Information, where Our professionals shared their expertise on investigative journalism, social media, and AI. Our contribution to the Canadian media ecosystem also includes helping other media outlets and official language minority communities. Recently, we reached an agreement with Envol 91 FM, Winnipeg's French language community radio station, to allow them to continue broadcasting their signal from our antenna. Moreover, we've also spearheaded the defense and promotion of causes we have in common with other Canadian media. We have collaborated with Chorus, Global News, Torstar, La Presse, and Bal Media, among others, to combat online harassment of journalists.
As public broadcaster, our mandate is to inform, enlighten, and entertain. To do this, we need to keep up with how and where Canadians are consuming content, while also supporting the media sector. Our strategy focuses on three priorities: proximity, digital agility, and bringing people together. To improve our proximity and services to Canadians, in January, CBC News opened 11 new bureaus to better serve and reflect the concerns of people in communities such as Chateauguay, Dawson City, Richmond, Peel Region, and Swift Current. CBC also has strengthened its local coverage in Hamilton, Fort Smith, and Lloydminster. Radio-Canada a fait de même en annonçant plus de ressources journalistiques.
Radio-Canada did the same, adding more resources in 22 communities, including Calgary, Charlottetown, Gaspé, Kelowna, Saskatoon, Shawinigan, the Montérégie region, and Moncton.
And what better example than our coverage of the Olympic Winter Games? In a Léger survey, 80% of Canadians said that it was important that Canada has a public broadcaster to cover major sporting events like the Olympics. And 71% said that our Olympic coverage allowed them to follow athletes from their region. In total, the Games attracted over 89 million streams on our digital platforms. Cela démontre que le diffuseur est à l'écoute.
This shows that the public broadcaster is listening and adapting to reflect the changing consumption habits of Canadians. We are adapting to these changes by collaborating with other Canadian media outlets, as with our Olympic coverage, which was done in partnership with TSN, Sportsnet, and RDS, and by ensuring our content is discoverable and accessible on the platforms Canadians use. On this subject, the committee has invited me to speak at a later date about our agreement with Amazon to carry ECRDI and CBC News Network on Prime Video. However, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about that today. In closing, I would like to emphasize that the diversity and vitality of the Canadian media ecosystem are central to our strategy and our mandate, and we are fully committed to playing our part in supporting a healthy and diverse media landscape in Canada. Thank you. Thank you.
To local independent television stations, Calvin Miller and Rod Schween. Collectively, sirs, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. My name is Cal Miller, and I'm here in my capacity, as you mentioned, as chair of the Local Independent Television Stations Group, or LITS, and I'm also president of Channel Zero, owner and operator of CHCH. With me today is Rod Schween, president of Pattison Media, with television stations in Kamloops and St. George, and 51 radio stations spanning the 4 western provinces. You heard from LITS members RNC Media and Télé Interréveil on April 14th. A fact sheet on LITS has been provided with this statement. All independent broadcasters operate through a combination of entrepreneurship, commitment to a community, and optimism. As many of you remember, 2009 found the late Izzy Asper's CanWest Global bankrupt. Shaw Media bought most of CanWest's local stations, but a handful, including RCHCH and Czech TV in Victoria, were orphans, redundant in a national network that favored reach over local service, and they were slated to close. We acquired unprofitable CHCH at the time. Our management team had grown up watching CH. We knew, or at least we gambled, that CHCH could have a future and took it back to its past, rooted in its community, anchored by local news, and run locally and prudently. Coming up on almost 2 decades later, I think it's fair to say we have had a measure of success. We produce and air 30 hours of local news and information weekly, probably more than any other local broadcaster across the country. And up until recently, we were able to run this as a private business that made some money and that matters in our community. We believe we matter more than ever, but this year we will lose millions of dollars.
Here at Pattison Media, we first got into the business of local television in 1987 when we acquired our Kamloops station. Now, both Kamloops and Prince George are obviously much smaller markets than Hamilton, each with approximately 100,000 people. And I trust you can appreciate that providing local news to markets of this size with advertising as the only commercial revenue has never been easy. Yet what we at Let's all have in common is that our past challenges pale in comparison to the challenges that we face today. When Pattison bought Kamloops, the internet effectively didn't exist. When Cal's company took over CHPC, and again, we're only talking about 2009, total revenues for TV station in Canada were 2.1 billion. Today, they are 1.5 billion. Now, that might not sound like a big drop, but realize that after inflation, that represents a 50% drop. And for Litz, that 50% drop has to date resulted in the closure of 5 local stations. How did that happen? Did we just forget how to run TV stations? Did we lose our relevance, our collective competitive edge? No, I don't think so. What happened is that the internet advertising grew from $1.8 billion in 2009 to a whopping $20 billion today. Let that sink in. Over the course of a couple of decades, Google, YouTube, and Facebook, platforms that have almost zero content costs and infinite advertising inventory, grabbed almost 75% of Canada's advertising market. We didn't lose that advertising because we have nothing to offer Canadians. We lost it because U.S. tech giants figured out how to monetize Canadians' attention in a way that costs them virtually nothing. The implications of that are huge. They go well beyond the impact on Litz and our ability to provide local news. The relevance to this set of hearings, however, is blindingly simple. If Canada wants to maintain a Canadian-owned and controlled broadcasting ecosystem, something this committee insisted remain a policy objective in its review of the Online Streaming Act, if we want a truly sovereign nation, a democracy in which Canadians make decisions based on facts and considered analysis, not fake news and foreign influence, we have a lot to do and not a lot of time to do it.
Yep, you're on mute, Cal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You've already heard from a number of witnesses who have helped diagnose the problems and propose solutions. Absolutely vital is that the government does not give away either the Online Streaming Act or the Online News Act in trade negotiations. In fact, on the latter, in February, Litz filed an application with the CRTC to bring Meta under the Online News Act. Our specific recommendations for government are as follows. We have commentary on each of these recommendations, by the way, in our written opening statement, which unfortunately we do not have time to read. First and foremost, we ask you to support the CAB's request for emergency bridge funding of ILNF. Going forward, we have 3 recommendations to build a viable and sustainable news ecosystem for all broadcasters. 1, extend the journalism tax credit to broadcasters. 2, have the federal government commit to directing at least 25% of its advertising budget to trusted domestic professional news organizations. And 3, eliminate advertising tax deductibility on foreign platforms. In their earlier appearances, RNC Media and Tele Interrive spoke about the urgency of the situation. And if that support isn't imminent, cuts in news hours, journalists, and ultimately station closures are all but inevitable. Thunder-based TV stations are at a similar risk as are those of Miracle Channel and Pattison. Ourselves and Czech and NTV have a little bit more runway, but as things stand, news cuts are likely this summer, possibly fall. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians in smaller communities will lose a significant amount, potentially their only source of local news. We are here to ask you to help ensure that doesn't happen. We thank you and be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you to you both. Thank you for reminding us of that story. Also, Mr. Miller, I lived through that whole process, and I will never forget the day we were all brought into a room and told that if we don't find a buyer for you in a month, you're going black. So thank you for that reminder. We will start questions with Mrs. Thomas now for, I'm sorry. Torstar Corporation, Angus Frame. I'm discombobulated a bit because my timer went off. I gave you a bit of extra time because of the sound issue, but apologies for that. Mr. Angus Frame, you now have the floor for 5 minutes, and I'll try to make sure my timer doesn't make noise this time.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for having me. My name is Angus Frame. I'm the president of Torstar Corp. I spent the first 12 years of my career as a journalist before moving into digital leadership and product building. I've spent my career at the intersection of journalism and technology, building the platforms that deliver the news to Canadians. I'm here today to represent Torstar's more than 350 journalists, all based in Ontario. From the Toronto Star to the Hamilton Spectator to our suite of hyper-local community brands, including the Smiths Falls Record and the New Hamburg Independent, and many more, our reporters are often the only ones in the courtroom, in the City Hall. Without them, many Ontario communities would simply have no local reporting at all. The stories we tell, whether Brendan Kennedy's story of prisoner abuse at Maplehurst Correctional Institute, or the Peabody-nominated podcast Left to Their Own Devices about online harms, the work we do is not possible without the talent of dedicated journalists and the resources to support them. Over 11 million Canadians come to our network of site, apps, and feeds every month. We are deepening our relationship with them and diversifying our business through new digital products, partnerships, and events. And we are investing in the next generation. This year, we are hiring 40 new or student journalists. The stability provided by federal programs has given us the predictability needed to make these hires, expand our footprint, and invest in local news and high-quality journalism. However, our resilience is challenged by an increasingly abusive environment. Canadian journalism faces multiple market failures caused by big tech monopolies. U.S. courts found that Google maintains a monopoly over the tech ad stack. They act as the buyer, the seller, and the exchange, taking a massive cut of every advertising dollar. The court also found that Google had engaged in several unlawful schemes, including manipulating its ad exchange auction and rigging bids so that its own customers would win. This has deprived publishers of billions in ad revenue worldwide. Foreign giants control the entire tech stack. They have inserted themselves as an unavoidable gatekeeper, controlling who can compete in digital markets and who can be seen and heard. Google has controlled traffic for years and has wielded the power to make or break publishers with changes to their core algorithm, which remains veiled in secrecy. More recently, Google's AI overviews summarize content and present it to users in a way that discourages a click-through. Publishers don't get traffic, attribution, or revenue from this practice that effectively steals our content under the guise of innovation. We are fighting the theft of our content, but we cannot do it alone. We need a regulatory environment that recognizes that journalism is not just another content type. It is fundamental infrastructure for a functioning democracy. When big tech undermines the business model of local news, they replace it with AI slop and a fractured ecosystem where mis- and disinformation thrive. This makes it increasingly difficult for Canadians to operate from a place of shared knowledge. We see the Ontario government taking a positive step with their ad set-aside program, prioritizing local media. Ottawa must follow suit. The federal government is weakening our information sovereignty by turning away from Canadian media and platforms while funneling millions of tax dollars into the coffers of foreign tech monopolists. I will leave you with a challenging scenario. Imagine that tomorrow the government faces an emergency and needs to communicate urgently with Canadians. The only way to do so will be through channels owned and controlled by Silicon Valley billionaires in the Trump administration. This is no mere hypothetical. These actors can exercise control over Canadian institutions and our press and our civic life. I ask each of you to remain vigilant about big tech's power over Canadian policymaking. Many so-called Canadian associations are dominated by U.S. big tech. As Canadians' elected representatives, I urge you to guard against the false narratives about Canada's best interests. You can do this by asking, does a proposal counter big tech's power over Canada, or does it ignore or even accept that power? If the latter, you are not hearing a solution. You are being urged to surrender. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Very well said, sir. Thank you very much. Finally, we go back online to Mr. Rudyard Griffiths with the Hub. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Madam Chair, thank you, and thank you to the committee for the invitation to appear today. Your study underway examines journalism and media in Canada, including, and I want to focus here on the words of your motion, issues of fairness and competition. And that's where I want to focus my remarks. First, a brief word about the Hub by way of background. I'm its publisher, co-founder with my colleague, Sean Spear. This month, we marked our 5th year anniversary as a digital news and commentary startup. In the last 12 months, we're pleased that over 28 million engagements with our platform, predominantly by Canadians from coast to coast. At 300,000 monthly downloads, our podcast feed is one of the country's largest, dedicated to the issues that this committee cares about, Canadian politics, economics, and public policy. We think that growth tells us, all of us, something important. There's a real public appetite, clearly, for new voices and new perspectives in the national media mix. We built our national audience, we're proud of it, through private grants, subscription, advertising, sponsorship, and events. And unlike virtually all of our peers, large and small, we have not utilized government subsidies to fund our news, journalism, and public commentary. To that extent, we believe the Hub's continuing success is a powerful proof point that high-quality journalism and serious policy analysis can thrive independent of government subsidies. But that may not remain true for much longer, not only for the few remaining non-subsidized outlets, and ultimately maybe not for the Hub, which brings me back to my topic of fairness and competition, which is at the heart of your study. By refusing to use subsidies to fund our journalism, we compete on an uneven playing field. To state the obvious, the labor tax credit is not tied to any meaningful performance metric. It is allocated on a journalist headcount alone. That conveniently rewards incumbents who have had decades to build subscriber bases that sustain their newsrooms. Great for them, congratulations. But startups, meanwhile, have to build their audiences from scratch. They have to go from 0 to 1 to 100 to, in our case, over 30,000 subscribers. And with no subscriber base to fund the newsroom that would qualify them for meaningful support in the first place when they're starting out, like we were starting out 5 years ago. Adding insult to injury, large incumbents engage in predatory subscription pricing. You've all seen it. $1 for 6 months, $1 for a year. They do this knowing that taxpayer supports will make them financially whole at the end of the day. This scheme, the payroll tax subsidy scheme, is also inexplicably anonymous. Recipients are not disclosed. That means that outlets like the Hub, who believe that journalism not funded by government, large S, is a key selling point to potential readers, we cannot differentiate ourselves on the very issue of press independence because of the anonymity of the subsidies and how they're given out. Think on that for a moment. At the Hub, we've come to accept, though, the reality that despite undermining public trust in the media, and I can speak to that, I've got hard data on it, freezing incumbents in their dominant positions and stifling innovation among new digital startups, we've, I guess, reconciled ourselves that these once temporary government supports are now permanent, and they are likely to continue to expand. Between the Canadian Labour Journalism Tax Credit and the Local Journalism Initiative alone, Canadian taxpayers are spending close to $100 million a year on news subsidies. So let me offer 4 quick practical reforms that I think could make better use of this money. First, end anonymity. If the media industry believes, as it says all the time, that transparency is the basis of public trust for all institutions, including government, well, apply that standard to itself. Canadians deserve to know which outlets are receiving public money vis-a-vis the labor tax credit and how much. Second, stop subsidizing headcount. If you're going to subsidize the press, reward outlets for growing their audiences, not their overhead. Tie a meaningful portion of the credit to reach, engagement, and subscriber growth. Reward outlets that Canadians are actually choosing to read, like the Hub. Third, require a code of conduct. Outlets taking subsidies should declare them openly and regularly in their mastheads, on their websites, in their annual reporting. They should be discouraged for using their own platforms to lobby for more government money, something that is now pervasive across much of mainstream media. That's a conflict of interest, and it further erodes public trust. And finally, and here I'll conclude, mandate that payroll subsidies actually go to fund journalism, not cash payouts to owners and bondholders. The Canadian Journalism Collective already requires this of Online News Act funds. The same rules should apply to the labor tax credit and be tightened to require mandatory financial disclosure by recipient outlets of exactly how they are spending the public's funds on their news and journalism operations. I'll stop there. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Now we will move to questions from members, starting with Mrs. Thomas for 6 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much. Sure. Ms. Bouchard, one of the comments that you made in your opening remarks, you said that foreign giants are monopolizing ad revenue. And then further to that, another witness added that it would be about 75% of Canadian ad dollars that are going to foreign giants. Certainly, we see that as an issue, and it is concerning. My concern is furthered, though, however. It doesn't just seem to be advertisers that are choosing these foreign giants, but actually it's our Prime Minister. Just on Sunday, he came out with what seemed to mimic a State of the Address, similar to something that Trump would give in the United States. And instead of choosing the CBC, which I would think would be his natural choice given that it's Canada's broadcaster, he chose to put it out on YouTube, an American tech giant. And so I'm curious what you make of this and why you think that choice was made by the Prime Minister in his office.
Not privy to why the Prime Minister chose this particular vehicle. Of course, there are processes for government address to the nation through CBC for official announcements of various kinds. Otherwise, we have standing invitations for most politicians to come to our various programs. I don't know. I can't speculate on the question.
Okay. It's well known that within the CBC, both trust towards its media provisions is down from the general public and viewership is down. Do you think any of that had to do with the reason?
I would want to qualify your statement. The trust in the public broadcaster in general holds relatively steady at around 75%. I don't have the precise numbers, but this is a significant number. And usage in general across platforms is relatively steady as well. I mean, we see movement between conventional services such as linear television and movement towards digital platforms, podcasts, fast channels, our website. And so I wouldn't characterize it as a downward trend in general.
Does it concern you that the Prime Minister chose to go with an American platform, YouTube, instead of coming to Canada's public broadcaster, the CBC?
Again, I don't have a particular position as the public broadcaster in terms of where the Prime Minister chooses to address his concerns. He comes to our stations. He's come to various programs, and I think there's plenty of journalists from CBC who are able to ask questions and provide some exposure to his statements, but this particular statement I can't explain.
Right. Yeah, I think most of us are having a hard time being able to explain it, actually. Interestingly enough as well, again, you're talking about ad revenue being monopolized by these foreign giants. The current government also spends the vast majority of its advertising budget with these same foreign giants instead of coming to Canadian companies. So I'm curious, are you in support of that decision by this government?
I am fully in support of my colleague broadcaster's position that there should be an effort made by all public undertakings to support Canadian media through advertising. I think
sorry,
that's a wise
I'll just
way
pose
to
my
spend
question
it.
again. This current government, this current Liberal government, puts the vast majority of its advertising dollars into big American tech giants. They do not choose Canadian companies overwhelmingly. What is your position on that? Do you agree with that decision by this government?
I'm in agreement with the position that the CAB and other media, Canadian media, have made, encouraging government to invest in Canadian media. That is my position.
Okay. One of the things that the CBC loves to talk about is these supposed news deserts. You listed off a number of cities that the CBC has put a presence into over the last couple of years. You listed places like Lloydminster, Calgary, Moncton. Now, we've heard from numerous witnesses at this committee who have said there is local coverage in these places. And they actually feel quite targeted, actually, by the CBC, quite under attack by your organization, because the CBC comes in and actually comes in with $1.6 billion of taxpayer money plus ad revenue, and then is able to then dispel these local organizations that are doing good work. I mean, these are local people who live in the community, they're a part of the community, and they're reporting on the community. CBC comes in with transplants, puts people there maybe for 6 months, maybe up to a year, and then they usually transfer out to other jobs or opportunities. They're not a part of the community. They're not living there long term. They don't understand it. And so the CBC has this unequal playing field that is created because they're coming in with government dollars and ad dollars, and then they're able to dispel these smaller players who have been there for years, sometimes decades, or even up to a century. How do you feel about that?
Well, I would qualify a lot of the statements that you have made. First of all,
Just to be clear, these are not my statements. These are statements made by these local news initiatives that are doing good work on behalf of their communities.
Mrs. Thomas, I was just trying to reflect on all of your commentary, including the cities that you've mentioned. I think we've had a station, both in French and English, in Calgary for years and years and years. So this is not a news desert. We are reinforcing our coverage in smaller locations where we have not had a presence before. Sometimes there is local media there, sometimes there is not, so not everything is equal or the same. When we do have local media, which we are hoping to collaborate with, we enter those markets with conversations with local media to see how we can help each other and how we can support each other through training opportunities, to facilities sharing. We are there not to extinguish existing media, but
Ms.
to
Bouchard,
enrich.
with all respect, they don't see that. That's not how these local news companies perceive the CBC.
With respect, Ms. Thomas, I actually go out in those markets and meet with local media. And I have those frank conversations with them face to face. And so do our news people.
I'll turn the floor now to Mr. Al-Sood for 6 minutes. Sir, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witness for being with us today. Ms. Bouchard, I want to begin by setting the tone for my questions. You will be popular this morning. I have a deep respect for the work of the CBC. I believe in its mission. I believe in the integrity and good faith of the people who work within it. And I believe its role is more important now than ever. As Canada's national broadcaster, you carry a unique responsibility, one that comes with heightened expectations around transparency, credibility, and public trust. You are asked to do more than most, often with fewer resources than your international counterparts. The nature of my questions today is to reflect concerns and perspectives that have been raised throughout this committee's proceedings. Some of these do not reflect my personal views, but I think it's important that they be addressed directly and on the record. I'll admit that you've beat me to my first question on the idea that the CBC could play a greater role in sharing its infrastructure, that is equipment, facilities, other resources, with smaller outlets where appropriate. So instead I'll ask this. We've heard concerns that the CBC at times operates as though it is competing directly with private sector news organizations. How do you view the CBC's role within the broader media ecosystem? And do you in fact see yourselves as competitors to other outlets or as complementary to them?
This is something I addressed in previous appearances before this committee. My personal philosophy is that as a public broadcaster, we are responsible to make sure that our actions are at the same time serving the citizens and encouraging a vibrant media ecosystem. And that means entering into all sorts of discussions, and I've listed a number of them in my opening remarks, where we can help support independent media, community and privately owned, and we do that by various initiatives. These are very dire times, and I am very, very concerned. And the stories that we heard this morning about the fragility are just one of the examples that we live through every day. So this is part of our team's responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean one story or one side always sharing storylines or angles. It's important that there be different points of view, different voices in a market. That's why it's important that there's diversity of ownership and of format of news. And that's what we're trying to help preserve.
Thank you, Ms. Bouchard. Another concern raised is the idea that the CBC, given its scale and resources, sometimes draws from journalists. I believe that was just asked. I don't know that you were given the time to respond. So how would you respond to that characterization? And what responsibility do you believe the CBC has in supporting healthy distribution of journalists across our country?
First, I want to say that our first interest when we try and start a new operation, a new bureau, is to ensure that we will have somebody who knows the local community and who will stay. We all have that interest, local independent media, community media, or CBC. We all want, or bigger media, we all want to have local people reporting on their community. Sometimes that means that we have to develop new training paths because it's not necessarily, and that can serve other media as well. And we've had those discussions where we can share training capacity that we have, or that we can trigger with colleges and universities to the benefit of independent and community media in the market. And so, yes, we are looking to have people locally who will stay and commit to that community. We don't approach journalists from other media, but if there's a posting, we can't stop people from applying. That's a reality. It's not, we can't keep people in, we can't exclude people, but we don't approach them. And then there's plenty of cases where they come to us and eventually they've gathered their experience and they're looking for something else. Journalists are known to want to gain experience through various postings. And sometimes they go to some other media in the same town or in another community. And that's the situation that we deal with all the time. So we are recruiting and concerned about having enough professional journalists to feed all of the media that are out there and want to hire them. And that means trying to work together with other media and with colleges and universities to be able to train more journalists, because unfortunately a lot of them are exiting the profession because of the precarity of the circumstances.
The CBC is often subject to criticism on trust. It was just alluded to not long ago. You highlighted a figure roughly 75% in that range. I'd like you to walk us through the mechanisms currently in place to ensure editorial independence and transparency and accountability at the CBC, and what you believe defines credible, high-quality journalism today.
Well, first of all, we have long-standing, very extensive journalistic standards and practices. There are our own. They are a model for others, and each media has their own, and that's rightly so. But we are influencing each other, and we have a code of conduct that teams are held to. There's a healthy debate in all of our newsrooms about what subject to cover, what angles to cover, what guests to chase. There is an editorial process where stories are vetted, where sources are checked, where we do have teams that are specialized now in verifying information because there's so much misinformation and AI-generated images that we have teams specializing in debunking this type of material that is toxic to some extent or could be very misleading. So we have very rigorous processes that are a process of debate within our own newsrooms. And then there's accountability. If we receive a complaint or a concern, the news management is responsible to reply and answer. And that gives rise to an examination of the process that was followed. And if the person who wrote in a complaint or a comment is not satisfied with the answer, they have access to a completely independent ombudsman. They are responsible for French and English services to answer and review completely over the journalistic work that was done. And then they come out with their ruling. Our ombudsman's rulings are very useful. Because internally.
I don't mean to cut you off. We've just run over time, but well done. Thank you. Mr. Champoux.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
6 minutes.
6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Welcome once again, Madame Bouchard and all our other witnesses. Thank you so much for being here. Madame Bouchard, starting with you. The $150 million question. The government gave $150 million extra dollars to CBC Radio Canada. What happened with that money? Please tell us how that money was spent or invested. Is there any money left over? Do you have any other projects? Please give us a little update. Thank you. The $150 million in the budget in November were voted on by the Parliament at the end of March. We received it. The money was distributed according to our strategic plan in a budget that was voted on by the board. And the money is invested according to our strategic plan, so it's not for specific projects. Or, yes? Okay, go ahead. In my opening remarks, I talked about adding journalist jobs. That was a major priority to increase local news. And so we've added multiple journalism jobs in order to work for CBC and Radio Canada. We've also invested in improving our online platforms in order to promote discoverability, as well as the ease of promotion and prominence of local, regional, national content and entertainment content. We also invested in independent news because many broadcasters have made cuts in that area. So that was money that was committed that won't be spent immediately until production is available. This is what bothers me, that $150 million. Well, it's not slated to be reattributed in the next year. So will you be able to keep those journalism jobs that you invested in? Is that at risk? Will you be able to maintain those jobs? When I said that we invested in under the context of our strategy, well, we knew it was temporary money. We knew we had to move forward because it was a priority. Canada needs these journalism jobs. We need to be better cover all of our communities. And if it's not renewed, well, we'll have to make choices. But we're going to protect those priorities. I think the priorities that we're hearing from this study really are journalism coverage in rural areas. Well, I think that the presence of as many voices as possible, a diversity of information in rural areas is really key. As you know, in my opinion, the public broadcaster has an important role to play while collaborating and perhaps competing as well. Perhaps we need to stay alert to how that collaboration is done, but I think your rural coverage is important. Now let's talk about Greater Montreal. I know that in rural areas there are journalism jobs put in place, but in Greater Montreal we've heard a lot of worry recently. The Laurentians isn't adequately covered. And notably, the public broadcaster doesn't have coverage there. You're right. Greater Montreal, well, the demographics are changing, and a lot of people have moved to Greater Montreal. And the Montreal newsrooms covered it before, but it wasn't enough. So we've announced 2 jobs in French-speaking Radio Canada in Terrebonne-Lanaudière, 2 jobs in Laval-Mirabel. So they cover the lower Laurentians, 2 jobs in Brossard, South Shore, and Montérégie, and now 2 jobs in Mont-Tremblant, Upper Laurentians, and 2 jobs in Vaudreuil and Eastern Montreal. We didn't announce them in the first wave, and so I'm happy to tell you about those last 2 jobs. Earlier, when you responded to my colleague across the way, the chair said you were going overtime, and she interrupted you. So I'll ask you a question Quebecers want to know. Why can't we see the playoffs? Because the Habs are often in overtime. Why does Radio Canada not show the playoffs so we can follow the Habs, so we can watch the Habs? Well, listen, the NFL is a business. The NFL manages those rights in order to get as much money as possible from the markets and doesn't take into account accessibility or free access for Canadians as a priority. So different partners negotiated to have the rights, and clearly it's monetized, and they paid a lot of money. So I'm not criticizing them, but they put it behind a paywall because it was so expensive for them to get the rights. And we simply do not have the means to access that market. Thank you very much. But we do invest quite a lot in women's hockey, and that's excellent, and please keep on doing that.
Overtime. Mr. Waugh, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to go to Rod Sween. Thank you for hosting me. I was in Kamloops a little over a month ago. Thank you for the tour of your facility. I do know.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Lots of memories with Bill O'Donovan and so on, because we used to work together in Saskatchewan. But my question is, you closed Medicine Hat, as you know, June 3rd. Did CBC, Ms. Bouchard says in her statement that she does collaborate with other media. So when you exited the market in Medicine Hat, CHAT, which had been there for 70 years, did CBC reach out to you as an independent television station leaving? She claims that they collaborate with media. Had you had any talks with CBC when you did leave Medicine Hat?
Look, I'll say we do a lot of work with CBC on the transmission side. We're very good partners with each other. We rent transmission space from them. They rent transmission space from us, and we've had a wonderful relationship with them in that regard. But unfortunately, when we exited Medicine Hat, and I saw some of the coverage from the committee earlier, it was suggested that we couldn't compete with CBC. I'll be very clear that our decision to exit Medicine Hat came before CBC added to its bureau added its bureau in Medicine Hat. But no, to answer your question directly, no, unfortunately, they have not. We have not had any conversation. And I respect the fact that they will come to the market and they will put out a job posting. We have to do the same thing in our markets, and we obviously would respond as well. But boy, I would love to have that conversation where we could collaborate on bringing journalists to markets like Medicine Hat, because we have a great difficulty in that. And unfortunately, when they came to Medicine Hat, they did take one of the remaining journalists that we had decided to keep in Medicine Hat and still try and service the market with our local radio stations. So instead of helping us in that market, they left us without a journalist in that market, and then having to go out and retrain somebody else. Because of course they're going to hire the person that we've spent time and money investing into and knows the market and knows the people, has the contacts, and we're left to start all over again.
Yeah, Mr. Sween, we have heard this not only in Medicine Hat, we've heard it all over. Ms. Bouchard, you just heard from an independent news operator that said you are poaching people. I
didn't hear him say we were poaching.
I'll rephrase it.
No.
Mr. Sween said you've walked into Medicine Hat and took one of his employees that they have spent months, if not years, training.
One of his employees did apply to the job. The job was filled after the station had closed. The same employee stayed with us for a little while and then moved on to another job in another province.
Yeah, so how does that further?
I'm saying we offered him an opportunity to stay in Medicine Hat. He did take that opportunity, but his own career, his own wishes, led him elsewhere. And that is business. That is what happens in human resources these days. People move. They move because they want other experience. And so we are all faced with the same challenges. And I'm sorry there was not a conversation at the timely moment for your station that was closing. I think that should have been a good reflex, and I'm trying to build that reflex as I travel across the country and meet with local leadership, just because we don't know what we don't know. If we ask questions, and I have had many, many conversations with local operators, and I always start with what's going on. What is working for you? What is not working for you? How can we help?
Yeah, okay, so the Medicine Hat is a gap. You've just heard the local independent TV where they pulled out of Medicine Hat. You didn't reach out to Pattison Media, which I think CBC should have. Mr. Sween, you just heard her comments. How does this help expand media? When they walk into a communities, poach or whatever, I'm going to say poach. Maybe Ms. Bouchard doesn't agree with that word, but how does that expand media in a community that is so-called a desert media when you did close the TV station down?
Well, again, I don't think it does, unfortunately. I mean, I wouldn't even call Medicine Hat a news desert after we exited the market. We made the decision to close the television station because, quite frankly, we had lost money in that market 6 out of the previous 9 years. We were slated to lose last year even before closing costs, so that would have been 7 out of 10 years that we would be losing in that money in that market. And so we made a decision to keep our radio operations going there. And so we haven't abandoned the Medicine Hat market. We continue to serve that market and many others. And unfortunately, this is not the only case where CBC has taken one of our employees. I agree, it's not poaching. The same thing happens with us. But respectfully, they can't say that then they're working to have conversations in these markets and help in those situations, because I've got, unfortunately, many other examples of that, and you've heard many other examples of that. So I would welcome that conversation. But I think, unfortunately, they're targeting markets that aren't news deserts in a lot of cases, and I would encourage them to do so.
Thank you. Ms. Royer, you now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pose my first question to Mr. Frame. Mr. Frame, you mentioned that you represent 350 journalists, and you talked about, you mentioned in the scenario of an emergency that it would be predominantly American news that would be reporting out to the Canadian people. I'd like you to imagine yourself in my seat or in the seat of a parliamentarian for a moment. And we know that we need to pivot in terms of supporting a vibrant local, credible news network across the country, coast to coast to coast. What are some of the policies that you would want to implement? What would be the priority in which you would roll these out? And maybe you could also speak to some of the international legislation that is happening right now, given the state of journalism, please.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. It's a good question in terms of policies that could be put in place to support the news ecosystem in Canada. And I think you asked more or less in priority order what I would do. So I would start with the easiest, and it's been alluded to already. I would follow the model set by the government in Queen's Park, as well as by the local government in New York City and in the state of Maryland, and set an example for the country by allocating federal ad spend to Canadian-owned and operated media, showing confidence in those channels, supporting those channels, and signaling to the private sector that this is a commitment to the country. From a policy perspective, I would then look more closely at some of the monopoly challenges that we're dealing with, specifically around Google. And you asked about other jurisdictions and what they're doing. There's been a lot of effort and investigation into the problem of AI overviews. So what happens is, and you've probably all experienced it, you do a search on Google, and instead of finding a collection of links to news sites where original journalism has been done, what Google does is they read all those news sites on your behalf, take that content and summarize it for you, creating a block between us and our audience and our business model opportunity. And they do this without our permission, our endorsement. And they do it in a way that we can't compete with, because their monopoly on search means we're not able to block their bots from crawling our content, or we put our own businesses at risk. And so places like the UK and the European Union overall are looking at this situation very seriously and investigating both sort of opt-in, opt-out potential in terms of AI overviews, and also there is a very live discussion in the tech community around the need for bots to disclose their purpose. So when a bot comes to your site, it has to identify honestly what it's doing, and so it can't come and index your content for search, but also use it for AI training. So I think there's a lot of work to be done around the policies that support the protection of content as the AI moment continues to grow around us. I referenced the court decisions in the United States around Google's monopoly over ad technology. So the Canadian government could follow that path, investigate the behaviors of Google and their control of the buy side, the sell side, and the overall marketplace for ad tech, and the proven illegal behaviors to corrupt that market to the unfair advantage of Google. So I would, again, start simply with the advertising set-aside policy of the federal government. I would then move into the challenge of AI stealing content and the need for permission and bot disclosures to be required. And I would encourage an investigation into the ad tech practices of Google in order to address the monopoly situation that we're trying to live with.
Amazing. So just very, very quickly, what is the hallmark of credible journalism versus non-credible in Canada?
As the CBC noted, we have publicly stated, publicly posted journalistic standards. We publish corrections when we make an error. We are accountable to our subscribers, our readers, and our communities. We also employ an ombud who will adjudicate when there's a complaint about our coverage and independently determine whether we've been onside or not. And if you were to contrast that to other institutions that have no such accountability, do not correct, do not claim a responsibility to the truth or to accuracy, you would see a stark line between the two. We published a story a couple of days ago about AI-generated the phrase is slopaganda, being spewed toward Albertans in support of separation. That kind of irresponsible AI-generated propaganda is the antithesis of what we do in terms of transparent, high-quality journalism.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Je passe la parole maintenant à Monsieur Chaumont.
Now, Mr. Shampoo, 2.5 minutes. I'll continue in the same vein. My questions will be for Madame Bouchard. Do you have rules regarding AI in your newsrooms? For instance, like agent de recherche, or do you have any news updates generated by AI? What rules do you have for your newsrooms at the moment? The newsrooms and all of our employees have AI tools at their disposal. They're available with a governance guideline. That's in order to speed up some tasks that can take a lot of time or involve a lot of paperwork. In the newsroom, when they need to sort through lots of information, that's when it's used. When we use AI, in the production process, which sometimes happens, it's openly stated, we're transparent. Moreover, we don't create any content with AI unless it's to show the process, because we've published explanations and breakdowns of what AI is used for, how it's used. So we try to explain AI, so sometimes we use it, but in a very transparent way. Well, the temptation must be real. And I can give you lots of idioms that can point to a journalist who's tired at the end of his shift who might use AI to edit something. Are there any ways that you can check or have oversight in newsrooms to make sure, or upstream, to make sure that journalists can't use AI to produce content? Well, first, our journalists have to follow our ethical rules. They work together. They see how they work. Well, sometimes no one's looking over your shoulder. Our newsrooms are very busy. Journalists are on site. They don't work all alone in their basement. So there's also an editorial process. And there's a producer or an editor that will go over what's been produced, be it text or video or audio. In the production process, there is a lot of oversight. There would be consequences if someone pretended to use their own brain, but actually was using AI. I have no reason to suspect journalists of doing that. I think journalists themselves are holding us to account as well. I'm thinking of journalists that are part of the Professional Journalists Federation in Quebec, and a lot of our journalists are part of that association. There's also a discussion underway between the union and the management about healthy use of AI. We can't completely put it aside. It really is a part of the ecosystem, and the younger members of our newsrooms learn to use it. So we have to put guidelines in place. We have to be completely transparent with the listeners and the users of our content, and that's how we'll go about things. Now, Mr. Genereux, for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Madame Bouchard, the Liberal government gave you $150 million before the last election, or that was an electoral promise that was carried through on. And then in 2026, 2027, there was a large cut announced. Is that right? Well, I wouldn't have said it like that. We did get $150 million in the 2025-26 budget. And in the tri-annual budget, there's no money in the budget. Now the year is underway, and it is possible that decisions are made, but I wouldn't interpret that as a cut. I would rather interpret it as funds that were reinvested that allowed us to make some investments. We are the only ones who decide on how we invest our money, and that's all. Well, are you expecting to have 40 million less in 2026, 2027? Because that's what was announced. So it's not. So you should be afraid of Mr. Carney, not Mr. Poilievre. You also received $7 million from Google, from the Canadian Journalism Collective. Since the beginning of the study, many media outlets support the closure or the disappearance of this. How is it that an organization like yours that is subsidized, highly subsidized, also gets money from the Canadian Journalism Collective? Why do you accept that money? You could have refused it if the Canadian Journalism Collective offered it to you. Excellent question. Remember this. This money comes from C18. And that establishes the principle that online platforms must pay those who are copyright holders who produce the journalism. So we produce journalism products, and they're protected under copyright. And the principle that that Google needs to pay for the use, including for a public service, is important. And it's important. And it was also put in place in Australia. It's a similar law. Well, that also applies to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation that gets money from online platforms for the use of their journalism product. So that's the principle from the get-go. Now, in the future, how can we use this money to support the sector? Well, those are discussions that will be ongoing. Some witnesses said that, well, they have a station in a rural area. And this witness just told us, along with other witnesses in the west of Canada, that Radio-Canada CBC's presence, well, so these small media outlets hire journalists straight out of school because Radio-Canada won't take them without experience. And then these small independent news outlets have to train them. And then when CBC Radio-Canada opens up new jobs, they offer much higher salaries than what they can offer. This was the question asked. Can you ally with Radio-Canada to CBC to do training? Is it up to the government of Canada, or would it be through Radio-Canada CBC? Would you have any money for training? Do you get money? Because you get so much money from Canadians. Maybe you could put partnerships in place with other media outlets, because businesses like the ones that came to appear before the committee, like you, well, they're losing ad money. And here, I'll just make an aside. Don't tell me that I'm out of time. Don't tell me I'm already out of time. Well, yes. Well, a short response. I completely agree that we should develop training programs together. We are trying to put that in place. We are having conversations to this effect. And whenever I visit rural areas, I start those conversations. And we also talk to training institutions, and we try and develop talent together and not always export it. Madam Chair, I think my 5 minutes are always shorter than everyone else's. That was over 5 minutes. Mr. Tumba, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Welcome, dear witnesses. Welcome, Madame Bouchard. The 2025-30 strategy has multiple goals. including opening CBC Radio Canada to the youth, to new Canadians as well, and establishes priorities for local news and bringing Canadians together. What indicators will you use to determine the success or failure of those goals? Thank you for the question. That will be based on the commitment, engagement, and listening to our content, as well as their perception of some attributes of our products and our services. Are we reliable? Do we reflect reality? Do we reflect the area? Do they trust services that we offer? Does it reflect the diversity of their local community? So, perception data. We are also going to measure our economic impact, our economic footprint. What do we bring to the Canadian economy through our activity? We also measure, like all proper dashboard, internal values. So, engagement of our employees, retention, diversity among our workforce. Where are our employees? Where are they throughout Canada? All of those measures are part of our values, and the public will be able to consult that as we unroll our strategic plan. We're already in the third quarter of our 2025-26 year, and we publish some of those measures, and that'll be published more in detail in our annual report. Thank you very much. Let's get back to funding. As my colleague mentioned, would it be possible for CBC's funding to be reduced without affecting Radio Canada? Well, they have distinct budgets, and the management between the English and French services is autonomous, but because we share infrastructure, we share workspaces, a lot of our systems are integrated, our information systems, all of our regional systems are integrated, the French and the English sides. There's a lot of collaboration. Often French OLMCs are really small teams, and they really depend on their English colleagues for photos and videos, and so there's a lot of integration in daily operations. It would be quite difficult to maintain the quality and the quantity of French language services if CBC was subjected to significant cuts. We're talking about the regions once again today. CBC Radio Canada in rural areas, has that contributed to private media's closures? Or was there a different impact? I heard from my colleague, Mr. Patterson, and seeing a news outlet close really is difficult to see. I can remember times when some of them were affiliated with CBC. So I have a long-term relationship with the rural areas, these rural news outlets that were always present in the landscape. So it's terrible what's happening. However, it's the economy, it's not us, that led to that. And that's what the witnesses' testimony has shown. However, if we could intervene upstream and find solutions, we would. That's what we did with, well, it's not a private station, but with Envol in Manitoba. They might have had to close. It's a French language community radio station, and we found a solution, a viable, long-term solution that took the economy into account. But we didn't throw the market out of balance. We're also in a market where there are other media outlets, and if we give it all for free, well, then people will say, oh, well, this is you're undercutting us. So we need to find the right balance. But when we talk about community radio, local news outlets that don't make a lot of money, well, we really try and find win-win solutions. And we didn't just start that yesterday, but it is in the beginning phase. And when I talk with my colleagues and upper management, my colleagues in rural areas, I have to tell them that we need to find solutions outside the box.
Mr. Diot, you have the floor now for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Ms. Bouchard, in your opening remarks, you mentioned Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. That's actually where I'm from, and many, many years ago, I started my career in broadcasting there at the CBC TV outlet. Unfortunately, that outlet is now gone. It's closed. CBC gets almost $1.6 billion. So why have you abandoned smaller markets like that in Sault Ste. Marie and in Alberta and throughout the country?
You know, I was part of the CBC back then, and I was in the law department. I wasn't in the field or in local newsrooms, but I remember how tragic it was that we closed down so many operations that we had in smaller markets to concentrate on one station per province. That was done for reasons back then of financial constraints. There were cuts in our appropriation, and you know, I don't fault the administration of the day, but it has been a constraint that has harmed our ability to serve adequately. And what we're doing now is, instead of building stations, which would make no sense, we are creating bureaus. We are creating capacity for local reporting and multi-platform broadcast. So we can get stories locally and then use other either digital, fast channels, newsletters in order to publish those stories and reach the local market.
Switching topics a little bit, there's a recently published book from a former CBC producer, David Cayley, titled The CBC, How Canada's Public Broadcaster Lost Its Voice, How it can Get It Back. So it examines recent coverage from CBC News. Two things that Mr. Cayley points out: that was two major recent events, that CBC identified the correct political line and embraced it without hesitation or exception. He said that CBC badly failed on covering COVID and also the truckers' convoy, whereby he alleges that CBC treated truckers as enemies of the state. We've also heard in this committee discussions about how the CBC covered the war in Gaza, and that it has a distinct anti-Israel bias. So what do you say to Canadians who say that the CBC is biased in its coverage?
I think my colleague described the processes that we go through and the standards that we uphold. Journalism is a daily process. It evolves every day. I don't think we can characterize our reporting in any other way. It's a process. And and we are accountable to citizens about that process. I don't believe that our reporters are pursuing a particular agenda. They are seeking the truth. They are double sourcing their information. They are doing a lot of field work, which is a luxury, I have to say, because we are publicly funded. It is important that we have foreign correspondents that are and envoys that are actually interviewing people who are living through some of these conflicts and some of these situations. So field reporting is really important because that's how the public can actually see for itself what is going on.
What do you say to criticisms of those three things that I mentioned? The convoy.
I say we are a public institution and we are subject to opinion and criticism, and I will uphold the right of anybody to have opinions about our coverage, but I will stand by the quality of our journalism any day.
We also heard from Peter Menzies, a former CRTC vice chair, who said that he thinks objectivity is an enormous challenge for public broadcasters, and he feels that most of your reporters are center-left. What do you say to that?
That our reporters are held to standards. They are not pursuing an agenda, and they are not pushing their opinions. They are basing their stories and their broadcasts on facts that they check. Then people can have opinions about that. That's fine. But that doesn't change the nature of the work we do.
Thank you. Mr. Miles, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for being here today. My question is actually for Mr. Schween and Mr. Miller. Many of us were elected in 2025, and so we didn't live through the C18 years. In terms of its establishment, we've come to this committee, we've heard about some of the challenges, particularly with Meta's decision to remove Canadian news content and the impact that that's had on a number of institutions and organizations, businesses. I wondered if we could just go back as you speak to its importance, and particularly for those of us who came in 2025, what was the original intent of that bill, and why is it still so important for you? You mentioned it as being, something you're concerned about its future. Maybe we can just go back a little bit and talk about its intent and where it's working. Obviously, the Meta challenge is another thing, but we can talk about that as well. But I'd love some insight. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. C18 was argued before this committee to a great extent, but my colleague Mary Philippe touched on this, or Ms. Bouchard touched on this, which is that the compensation from Google, and that they are the only ones paying into it right now, as you alluded to. But it's compensation. This isn't government funding. It isn't even funding out of a philanthropic issue. This is money that for the better part of 20 years, the online services have used our content often without attribution, and certainly without compensation. So the establishment has been crucial. It isn't enough. It doesn't replace or fairly compensate us fully, but it is a heck of a good start. Ron?
Mr. Schween, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think as Cal points out, we don't operate in a walled garden anymore, and we've got a level of competition that's unprecedented, and we still live in a regulatory world in a lot of cases that was designed and put together in a time when we did operate in a walled garden. As a colleague of mine in our company likes to say, we have way more people chopping at our tree. And you've heard the impact of the loss of advertising, and C18 isn't perfect, but it is the mechanism that we have in place at the moment. And what I'm really worried about is that the measures that are in place get set aside through ongoing trade negotiations. And the delays caused by that, the impact that those delays potentially are going to have on, LITS members and other media companies across Canada, that is going to be catastrophic.
I think, Mr. Frame, you spoke to this too as being also a matter of principle. I think you speak about this as a matter of principle in terms of copyright. Maybe we can speak to that a little bit as well.
So you're specifically talking
with
about
regards to C18 and why it was established in the first place. I think that's part of what's gotten lost a bit in this conversation, especially for those of us who weren't here through those years of establishing it.
Yeah, the way I think of C18 is it's payment in lieu of licensing agreement for copyright protected material. And so Google uses the material to their business benefit without formal permission, and C18 is a negotiated settlement in order to compensate for that behavior, and I would argue that it's working. I think Cal and Rod noted as well that money is flowing to publishers. It's being used to put journalists on the street telling the stories for Canadians. So it's a strong and courageous piece of legislation that is supporting the industry and making a difference to us.
And what is the appropriate response when Meta decides to then take all the the news content from Canadian sources?
Yeah, I have a different view about the Meta situation. I think they used Canada for theater. Meta has been backing away from news globally. My publishing colleagues in many different geographies around the world have all experienced significant drops in traffic referrals from Meta, specifically Facebook, which peaked in 2018. And so Facebook, Meta, was moving away from news. And Canada just presented a moment where they could be dramatic about it and make some noise and create a false impression about the value of their platform and the importance of it, and that it was actually part of a global strategy that they were rolling out, and we were just a convenient pawn in a narrative that they were creating.
Has it negatively affected your business?
The impact on traffic from Facebook was most notable in our community sites. We developed a number of fairly robust community groups and discussions and traffic channels that were built on reliance on Facebook, and we have had to work very hard to replace that lost traffic. We've done so successfully, and to create direct relationships with our readers, our audience, and we are doing that successfully. But it was absolutely a dramatic and negative impact to traffic, most clearly on the smaller community sites at Torstar.
Thank you. Monsieur Champoux, je vous donne la parole maintenant pour 2 minutes et demie.
Je trouve que c'est une très bonne.
I think that was a great point. And I really love your analysis of Meta's point of view. I worked on C18 at this committee. It was a piece of legislation put in place with a view to fairness for media. If C18 seems for some to be deficient, it's because of the online companies that are acting like they're in the Wild West. And they continue to just suck the lifeblood out of our industry. And I really appreciate my colleague's point of view. But because we're talking about online companies, Madame Bouchard, I have a question for you. I must say, I appreciated your reaction when we saw that RDI was on Amazon Prime. There was a really fast reaction, and you decided to pull out from Amazon Prime until, if I understood correctly, until the public broadcaster's content would be available on paying platforms. This is my question. Maybe it'll exasperate you, but who had this great idea in a context when we're denouncing online platforms? Who said, oh, it would be so great to be on Amazon Prime? That's my only question. I know that you're really on top of our strategy, and so I'm sure that you noticed when we said we will go where Canadians and Quebecers consume their content. We'll go seek them out there. The goal was to serve them where they get their content. However, it seems that Amazon has a Prime service that's well established in Canada that already broadcasts many Canadian channels, including Bell and Quebecor. According to my stats, around 50% of Canadian youth up to 35, on Amazon Prime. That's French and English youth. So if we want to meet Canadians and Quebecers where they're at with reliable information and of record, well, we have to go and seek them out where they are. That was the idea. However, we did acknowledge that by offering RDI on Amazon Prime as the only way to get it outside of cable, we were kind of forcing people's hands. And we thought we should step back and prioritize accessibility of RDI on Tout.tv, like CBC News is accessible on GEM. So people can still go through our own platform to get our services. It's like putting your own mask on before helping your neighbor in a plane. So it's accessible on our own platforms before having to go to another platform. But there will be people who will choose to go through Prime because that's the platform they use. And the Quebec government adopted legislation that aims to prioritize Francophone platform on foreign, or rather Francophone content on foreign platforms. So we continue to promote discoverability of French language content used by Canadians. And now.
Thank you very much. My question is to Mr. Griffiths. In your opening statements, you talked about the importance of establishing trust, and you made a comment with regards to grants being given by the government or money being given by the government in order to prop up existing journalists and entities. You talked about the fact that the way that it is done with the payroll tax subsidy, as you called it, it's rather difficult for new players to enter into the market. It instead boxes them out and protects the existing players. I'm curious, I guess, in terms of your view with regard to what this type of conduct from the government does to overall public trust toward the media. And I'm further interested in knowing your views on what this does to journalistic integrity and overall transparency, which I think the two are tied together, of course, trust and integrity and transparency.
Well, thank you, MP Thomas, for that question. I mean, just to bring some hard facts into the conversation, the Reuters Institute, the University of Oxford, well respected, has documented the decline of Canadian trust in the news. It's fallen fully by 55% from 2016 to 39% of Canadians now having trust in the media. Polling that we've conducted indicate that 76% of Canadians agree that government funding could undermine journalist objectivity. 67% of Canadians surveyed do not trust the government to decide which media organization qualifies for subsidy support. So I think we have to understand that this whole conversation has been a bit surreal for the last hour or so. It seems to be entirely focused on the large incumbent organizations, and I get that. They have powerful lobbyists, and clearly they've been very effective in designing a subsidy scheme that optimizes for their needs and to a large degree entrenches their incumbency for the reasons that I talked about. But I appreciate you raising the issue of trust, because nowhere in this conversation has anyone addressed the extent to which trust in the media is plunging, including trust in the CBC. So will we connect? Will we have the courage, the fortitude, the perspicacity to understand that there just might be a connection between large-scale government funding of the media and increasing public distrust in news and journalism, and the consequences of all of that for our democracy? And instead, it seems like we're having a conversation that's exceedingly convenient for many of the people testifying today in the organizations that they represent. It's basically about how can we maximize subsidies that we receive from government to maintain and sustain our business models, which again are legacy models that were built over decades. And I do not deny that they produce excellent journalism and they don't provide a public service. But other than my voice today, who's speaking for what we'll hope will be the next generation of media organizations that will come up in this country, that will develop new ways of telling Canadian stories, of writing effective journalism? Who's speaking for them? Where is the types of reforms to the subsidy model that could allow 1,000 flowers to bloom? And I'll end on this point. We're celebrating at the Hub our 5th anniversary after 5 years of building this organization from nothing to something. When I look around, I'm distressed to see that no one has followed us. There are very few, if any, new media startups of any size since these subsidies came into effect in 2019. And I think we have to acknowledge that the subsidy regime is doing something. It is squashing innovation. It is impeding new models and methods and types of organizations to renew our journalistic capacity in Canada. And I appreciate the question about trust, because it's something that we need to discuss. We need to connect it to subsidies, and we need to connect it to how the subsidy regime has largely frozen Canadian media, from the CBC to my old friend from the Toronto Star there to others in place. And we're just not seeing renewal in the industry. We're not seeing dynamism in the industry. And I would challenge anyone to argue otherwise.
Quickly, you said that there were consequences for democracy. What are those consequences?
Well, I think arguably the whole purpose of the subsidies was to support a vibrant media who in turn could provide Canadians with accurate information so they could make informed choices as citizens in the democratic dialogue that we are all part of. But again, I quote those numbers to you. Trust in news has fallen from 55% in 2016 to 39% in 2024. Much of the period covered off by the current subsidy regime. The subsidy regime doesn't seem to be having any positive effect on trust. And in fact, as our polling shows, 76% of Canadians, 3 out of 4, agree that government funding undermines journalistic objectivity. That may be true or not. In many cases, it's probably not true, but it's the perception of what large-scale government funding is doing to the media. This is a Faustian bargain that the media has entered into.
Thank you.
In order to save itself, it is ingesting these subsidies, and in turn, it is bleeding trust at the same time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Miles, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Super interesting. I found one thing very interesting, which was, perception is one thing, reality, it might not be reality. So part of the job, I think, of good journalism is actually to define the difference between perception and reality, and actually lean into the things that are real. We've heard a lot of talk in this committee about giving weight to organizations that actually don't have very much journalistic integrity, that lean very much into pushing perception of interference where there is no interference. So I think there's also a responsibility from a journalistic perspective to make sure that there is a line between perception and reality. And ideally, good journalism leans into reality. I think that's what we're all talking about. So I would, and I also find it interesting when we talk about the difference between 2016, 2025, it also corresponds with a huge breadth of news organizations and fake news online. It happens to correspond with some of this subsidization. We've talked about the subsidization and why it's important. So many organizations come in every day. It's because the market is failing. That we were, and large companies are taking advantage of obviously the content. But I find it interesting that the idea, there was also skepticism when large businesses were paying for advertising in newspapers. I grew up in I was in university in the early 2000s, and there was a lot of skepticism around corporate influence of large media organizations. Journalism is a practice. So I just think it's interesting because the corresponding distrust also comes with the growth of fake news online. And I think part of our job here is to make sure that we are drawing a line between what is true and what is not true. And the line has been vague at points in terms of what is considered real journalism. I have a question because I think we all agree we want a strong ecosystem with multiple players, including innovative online companies as well. We want that, particularly if their interest is true journalism and being accountable to readers and having journalistic standards and practices. But I think when we're talking about the public broadcaster, I guess I'm curious to know when we're talking about rural areas and we're talking about building out a bigger ecosystem, one question that comes up to my mind, and I think many people here, is advertising. And when you're competing with private companies for advertising, and I'm looking at other public broadcasters around the world, some of which rely on advertising, some of which don't, how does that play in terms of the relationship, particularly between private media and public media, and how do you perceive that in the international context?
There's many models for public broadcasters. Hybrid models of funding are prevalent. Sometimes there's restrictions on advertising in certain time slots or in certain types of revenue. Some are allowed to generate revenue abroad and not necessarily commercial revenue in their territory. There's many, many models. The one that CBC was founded on, CBC Radio-Canada, has always been a hybrid model where advertising on television and then on digital platforms was part of the whole financial basis for the delivery of services. So, of course, we don't generate shareholder interests or anything like that. All of the revenue that we generate through advertising is reinvested in and supports what we do in the service of Canadians. The advertising market has been declining for everybody on linear platforms. We don't have advertising on radio, and we haven't had advertising on radio for a long time. And this radio is really a local market for advertising, so I'm glad we don't have an issue with local advertising at that level. In most of the small markets where we are re-entering, we are entering with bureaus and not with stations, so we don't have inventory to sell specifically for linear television around the work that we do there. And it's unlikely that we would have any kind of impact on that market from an advertising point of view. In larger markets, yes, in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, we have a mix of national advertisers and more local advertising. What we do, though, and I want to point that out, and is that we are working with other publishers and with other media to try and regain a little bit more sovereignty on our own advertising market. The advertising market in Canada is comprised of about $25 billion. The bulk of it is owned by American giants. Only a small portion is actually exploited by Canadian publishers and Canadian operators in broadcast and in print and in digital. We form a very, very small part of that. The $25 billion, our advertising revenue is $250 million a year. It's just 1%. So can we work together to grow the part that Canadian media own and can benefit from together instead of fighting amongst ourselves? That's the proposal that we've got on the table, and that's why we are participating in a collective to try and, particularly with digital advertising, which has been really completely taken over by those platforms, those forum platforms, where we can work together to create value for all of us in Canada and regain some access to Canadian businesses wanting to reach Canadian audiences. And us remaining in the advertising market allows us to take sometimes the lead in those conversations, offer to pilot stuff with our funds so that it will benefit the whole community. So that's what we're doing.
I think your time's up. The Conservatives are still deciding who's going to go next. Let me throw this out there. We've heard a lot about the competition in different markets from CBC, but I worked at the Edmonton Journal in 1998. I think there were 4 radio stations, there were 3 or 4 newspapers, there were several TV stations. we all competed against each other, and we had more news and better news for it. So sometimes competition is good, I think, in communities. But you're still, are you ready? Mr. Dion, you have the floor. I'll just leave my comment there as is.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Griffiths, last week this committee heard from Peter Menzies, the former CRTC vice chair and former publisher of the Calgary Herald. He shared his belief that objectivity in newsrooms right now is, quote, an enormous challenge. Do you agree? How can we expect journalists to be objectives, for instance, when their newsroom relies on funding from the Liberal government?
Mm-hmm. Peter is a contributor and a columnist at the Hub, and we really appreciate his analysis. I'm possibly less concerned about objectivity than I am about a diversity of media, and especially media by type and size. And as I've discussed, this kind of inherent tension that seems to exist now between incumbent legacy media and, let's call it, startup independent media, the extent to which the subsidy regime is entirely has been entirely worked to the benefit of the former and not the latter. And I think objectivity will solve itself in the largely, I hope, in the eye of the beholder, that we will have more media outlets like the Hub that follow rigorous journalistic standards. The Hub is QCJO registered with Revenue Canada. We employ professional journalists. In fact, one professional journalist who had a reach out in the last week to 10 days from the CBC to see if they were interested in leaving the Hub to go work for the CBC. So I'm a little confused about our friend at the CBC's comments that they don't actively seek out talent amongst competitor organizations like the Hub. So I hope that answers your question. I really hope that the committee and its work in this study will focus on those key words in your motion of fairness and competition. I really think that that's where this discussion needs to go. And in that discussion, yes, we can talk about big tech, and we can talk about legacy media's concerns about competition vis-a-vis big tech, but let's not forget independent media, startup media, and our concerns about competition vis-a-vis legacy media in Canada. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Mentioned that 3 of 4 Canadians surveyed feel that government funding hurts trust. So what's the solution to that?
Well, sunlight is the ultimate antiseptic, and I think it's just jaw-dropping that we're putting tens of millions of dollars a year of public taxpayer funds into media organizations, and we are requiring no disclosure on their part that they are recipients of the labor tax credits. I mean, if media argues again and again that government should be transparent, that transparency leads to accountability, it is the sine qua non of their own journalism, then why do large legacy media outlets not disclose that they are beneficiaries of the labor tax credit and communicate to their readers, listeners, and viewers the millions of dollars that they receive? The National Post, to their credit, does do this because they have to file as part of their publicly traded status as a corporation. But many other media, including the Globe and Mail, I don't know if Angus can talk about the Toronto Star, whether it's been open about whether it has, in fact, availed itself of the labor tax credit. I assume it has. I don't see that anywhere in the Toronto Star. I don't see it on its masthead. I don't see that on the Toronto Star's website. So, I mean, come on, let's bring some transparency to this conversation. I think that would be one important first step towards restoring public trust.
You also mentioned that we need to do subsidies differently. Could you expand on your ideal model for that?
Yeah, I mean, look, just increasingly reconciled. These subsidies are not going away. And let's remember, everybody, we said in 2019 when we created this program that it was going to be for 5 years and then it was going to go away. And a lot of very respected voices in media signed on to that. And they said that that was vital, that this had a sunset clause. Well, we're now on the other side of that sunset clause, and we're talking about millions of dollars more going into various types of subsidy programs, and we've created new types of subsidy programs over the last 5 years. So just two ideas that I want to reiterate again. Stop subsidizing headcount. Why not switch the subsidy metrics from measuring the advantages that are inherent to incumbency legacy organizations and start allocating subsidies on the basis of audience reach, engagement, and subscriber growth. So that's, I think, far more equitable, and it would allow smaller organizations who are in the startup phase to benefit from subsidies, because right now they can't. It's a cart in the horse problem that this subsidy regime, especially the labor tax credit, has created. Again, I think it was created purposely that way by lobbyists for legacy incumbent media. Finally, I would just say, let's ensure that the payroll subsidies actually go to journalism. Right now, a lot of these large legacy organizations are private media. Those subsidies are going directly to owners and bondholders. They are not going to journalism.
Thank you. Mr. Chumba, un appel au règlement, Mr. Shampoo.
Mr. Shampoo, yes, I'd just like to highlight that we're having connectivity issues with some witnesses, and I experienced that at a committee yesterday as well. It's not the worst thing in the world, but these are problems that seem to be more and more frequent recently. I don't know if it's on our end or if it's with the witnesses, but it is something that we really ought to look into. As you know, it can become really difficult for our interpreters. Yes, that's true. It's not the first time either.
Kind of have flicked in and out a couple of times. I don't think we missed any of the content of your speech, but we were just making note of a bit of a connection issue here. Thank you. Mr. Tumba, je vous donne la parole, 5 minutes.
Mr. Tumba, 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Frame, the government wanted to support the media outlet faced with international competition. However, any government action has to strike the right balance between independence and autonomy. In your opinion, what role should the government play while remaining independent and retaining editorial independence?
And this will be consistent with my opening remarks and some of my comments earlier. The government needs to support a functioning marketplace for media. And absent a functioning marketplace, which we don't have due to the monopolistic practices of the foreign tech players, they need to find ways to support independent voices across the country. So the current programs that are in place, the journalism tax credit, the funding through C18, the LJI, are functioning measures absent a fully functioning marketplace. I think Mr. Griffiths and I almost share the same vision, but see different obstacles as being the major problems in getting there. I think the need for a diverse plurality of new and traditional voices across the news ecosystem in this country is healthy for democracy, it's healthy for the future of journalism, and it's something we would all like. But it's not something that can be accomplished when the market has been perverted the way it has been. And until that reality is corrected, we will need to work together, government, private media, to make sure that our industry continues.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bouchard, your organization has a unique place in the Canadian ecosystem, both in terms of news and culture in both official languages and rural representation. It's often a way to access reliable information. What's your role today to support a strong and accessible media ecosystem. In your opinion, how should it evolve in order to respond to technological innovation and changes? As I said earlier, we have to continue to develop services that are accessible and that take the changes that the changes of how citizens consume content into account. We have to take into account the platforms that they use that are accessible. We have to offer them a diversity of choices and give them a safe environment where they can always access our platforms to consume content. We have to do that work collaborating with the industry in a challenging environment. And so everything we do, like we did for grouped offers with the Bell platforms for interested, subscription to Tout.tv plus Crave, or working with our co-ops, our information co-op colleagues in order to share resources, in order to develop, to improve performance of Canadian media, notably in order to get more of the ad market, especially for connected TV. In the online environment, there's a lot of work to do in order to develop our sovereignty and accessibility for Canadian media. We want it to be a #1 solution for Canadian businesses rather than going through Facebook and Google. There's a lot that we can do, and it's new, honestly. I've been in the business for almost 40 years, and we always need to learn, and we always need to ask questions. That's what we do as journalists, and that's what we need to do with our colleagues. What can we do to move forward together and save our industry? Quickly now, Mr. Shampoo, 2.5 minutes. I don't have a lot of time to talk about such a big subject. Madame Bouchard. Journalist harassment while they're doing their work. A few weeks ago, a group came to appear, and I don't want to name them, I don't want to give them any publicity, but they have not wonderful practices. They target journalists that publish reporting that they don't agree with. Are you aware of that issue? Do the effects of that harassment of journalists, and we often see it's often women journalists who have to deal with this the most, and women might no longer be interested in being journalists. How do you deal with that issue? As legislators, as elected officials, what should we do in order to protect journalists' work? There are laws in place regarding criminal harassment and other kinds of unacceptable behavior as an employer. And as a responsible corporate citizen, first, we work to protect our employees, to make sure they're safe. We try and identify situations. And then we work with other media outlets that have also been victims of that kind of harassment. And we work with them to develop awareness on behalf of the public, so that the public rejects those practices. I think the public needs to show solidarity. We need to bring back civility into the picture. We've really beefed up our security measures for our journalists. Well, isn't it worrying to see that you have security measures so that people can do their work, and stronger security measures, but also psychological help, because it's not necessarily criminal harassment, but because you get 1 million emails because you published a certain report, well, that's really an issue, and it's not illegal because there's a freedom of expression. People need to have freedom of expression, but there seems to be a limit that's being pushed, yes. And it's our responsibility to explain it, to denounce it, and also to take concrete measures to protect journalists and protect them from that kind of behavior, reprisals. It's true that the digital environment allows all kind of communication and it can be really invasive. That said, we also remain aware of the accessibility to our journalists. We have to be able to know what the public is thinking. We need to strike the best balance, and we need to work with other media outlets that experience the same thing in order to find stronger solutions together and publicly say, no, this is not okay, that's enough. Thank you very much.
A quick 3 minutes for the Conservatives and 3 minutes for the Liberals before we wrap up. Who's taking it for you guys? Mr. Généreux, à vous la parole.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Mr. Généreux, over to you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madame Bouchard, why isn't RDI available on 2.tv when CBC CNN is accessible for free on CBC Gem? So, no, it's not available for free on CBC Gem. It's accessible through a paid subscription. That's the model. That's the model our specialized TV channels developed around 20 years ago with money from cable, and in order to be fair for our distributors who keep on paying to distribute our services, our streaming services. When we offer it on online platforms, we offer it behind a paywall. Now, this is why it's not available on 2.tv RDI. It's because there are some agreements with some distributors, and for the time being, that prevents us from doing so, meaning that the distributors, in the context of business agreements, wanted to restrict Radio Canada's ability to use their signal and use their RDI signal on their own platforms. They were business negotiations underway. So that means that at the time being, francophones throughout Canada are less well served with public money than anglophones. That's what it means. And the reason why you went to Amazon Prime, is this. Well, it shows, in my opinion, the reason why the Prime Minister went to YouTube for his speech. We're undergoing an Americanization of information in Canada. That's what I'm getting from this. That's exactly what's happening. And what does that mean? We're going to hit a wall. All independent media, well, it's going to take $2 billion, $3 million, $4 billion to fund Radio Canada because all the other local media is going to disappear. I mean, we're just going into it. We're going to hit a wall. And indirectly, you've just approved the fact that you went on YouTube instead of your service that's funded by Canadians. I completely disagree with what you just said, Mr. Généreux. Respectfully, I completely disagree. Radio Canada's information are broadly available to all Canadians in French on our online platforms via streaming. It's the sign of our linear information service, RDI, which is only accessible by a subscription for cable subscribers and for some subscribers to other things like River TV. Madame Bouchard, you decided to use 2.tv for broadcasting for francophones, and you decided to go to Amazon, an American chain. The Prime Minister, and the example that gives, telling everyone, oh, go towards the Americans instead of using Canadian platforms. The Prime Minister did it himself. The government of Canada is buying ads on American platforms. Why? Well, don't ask me the question, Mr. Généreux.
Anyway, Mr. Alsou, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Miller, Mr. Schween, we're increasingly seeing mid-sized private broadcasters operating in a squeezed environment, caught between global digital platforms, shifting advertising markets, and rising content costs. Companies like Channel Zero and Pattison Media are often forced to make difficult decisions about scale and programming in a rapidly changing media landscape. To what extent has the environment affected your willingness or your ability to invest in higher-risk public interest journalism, including investigative or local accountability reporting?
Thank you for the excuse me. Thank you for the question. If I could, I'd direct it to talking about probably the biggest economic driver that would I'm not going to call it a silver bullet, but could really make an impact for all of us around this table by increasing the amount of Canadian advertising that's directed to Canadian media. And that's a very simple message that has been a report that came out originally back in 2016 and has been updated repeatedly. In the Income Tax Act, to solve this very problem when it first occurred closer to 40 years ago now, there was a restriction on the deductibility of Canadian advertising by Canadian companies when they advertised on foreign media. 30 years ago, in 1996, we decided to exempt the internet, as it was simply known then, from that requirement because there was almost no advertising on it. Today, 3 out of every $4 in the entire advertising market, out-of-home radio, newsprint, television, online, all 3/4 of that goes to the online intermediaries, Google and Meta. And if that simple tax exclusion was removed from digital media in Section 19 of the Income Tax Act, it would repatriate slowly and at the choice of Canadian businesses, but it would repatriate billions of dollars back into the ecosystem. That's something that needs to be taken care of. That would provide the funding to be able to look at all of these things that we've talked about: increased local journalism, investigative journalism, and new media outlets like Mr. Griffiths.
Well, the thing I'll tag to Cal's comment is, one of our suggestions was we have the federal government commit to directing at least 25% of its advertising budget to trusted domestic news organizations. And I was waiting to attend the hearing this morning, and I was thinking, because we operate 51 radio stations in Canada, and we're expected to play 35% Canadian content on our radio stations. Does it not make sense, if that's an expectation of us, that we've only asked for 25%, but maybe we should be asking the government to spend at least 35% of its funds on Canadian media? I think if it's fair for the goose, it should be fair for the gander.
Thank you both.
Fair enough. Thank you very much to all of our witnesses for your excellent testimony today. Very much appreciated. I believe you've already sent in your opening statements, but if there's any further information, if something occurs to you later, if anybody's asked a question that you didn't feel that you had time to fully explain, please send it to our committee via our clerk, and we can include that in our consideration of our final report of this study. Thank you again. Meeting adjourned.